It's been a while since we've done a dissecting design here on the channel, but seeing as how I just went through the entirety of Command & Conquer from start to finish, I'm in the mood to talk about the franchise, my thoughts on what it did right, what it did wrong, and whether or not it still holds up today for RTS fans. The footage here seems on me taken from the Command & Conquer Remaster that was released in 2020, making it both the newest and yet oldest example of C&C, or at least the RTS side of things. With the original, this is a game that would set the standards for many of the RTS games that would come after it, but it does feel a little bit dated, again, just by the nature of time, and what we saw over the RTS genre from the mid-90s through to the mid-2000s. But this is a game that would set the stage for what will become the Tiberium saga of Command & Conquer. We are introduced to the GDI, or Global Defense Initiative, and the Brotherhood of Nod, ran by, of course, fan-favorite cult leader, possible alien, depending upon which game we're playing, Kane. And of course, Kane is portrayed by Joe Kukan, which hopefully I didn't butcher his name too badly. And he will proceed to ham things up and chew through all the scenery for, well, almost 20 years of the franchise. With the original, this game is, again, the most bare bones in terms of its design and implementation. Both factions do share some common units, and some of the major differences really come down to kind of the advanced strategies. GDI gets airstrikes and, of course, the mammoth tanks. Nod gets obelisks, flame tanks, and of course the stealth tank. With this one, we are introduced to the vertical command bar that is on the right hand side of the screen. And as a design question for everyone watching this, do you prefer the vertical command bar or the horizontal one, which would then become more famous by the likes of the Crafts, Age of Empires, and many others? I think I may be a little bit biased after spending 2+ weeks playing Command & Conquers, but I think I do prefer the vertical command bar. It just makes it easier to order and set general commands during the heat of combat when you're not focusing on your main base, where the horizontal one doesn't, I think, give you as much flexibility in that respect. From a GUI perspective, the command bar is used to allow you to pre-build any kind of structure and get units built anywhere that you're playing. Once a structure is finished, you can then place it in the world provided within the range of your base. This is also a game that would introduce the cheese strat of building lots of bunkers lots of sandbags or lots of power plants to extend the range of your base, allowing you to almost completely section off parts of the map or build defenses further out. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Command & Conquer that will come up in the later examples is that the AI is never really playing the game the same way as the player. You see, this is a great example of a scripted or event trigger based system. The AI essentially has two modes. It's kind of standby or default, and then when it goes rage mode on the player. During the standby mode, you'll have to deal with the enemies that are already on the field, and small defensive forces or offensive forces the enemy will pump out of their base. The second you attack their base, or heaven help you, the harvester, the enemy will go into I must annihilate you mode, and will quite frankly send literally everything it has to stop you. Now, while the AI does collect resources, they're not really used to build units as much compared to you, and it will pump out units provided it has any kind of unit constructor or unit structure available. And this would also set the standard of the default Command & Conquer strategy of send everything you have to destroy the construction yard, then destroy the unit production buildings, and then just mop up everything else. Mission structure is built on base and baseless missions, with the baseless ones being more like puzzle or tactical minded, where you must control a limited number of units, oftentimes a commando as well, to deal with an objective. These missions would become the bread and butter of Command & Conquer over the years, and they're a great change of pace, although the early games do feel a little too trial and error. This is also compounded by having the fog of war, where you can just walk right into a flame tank, or a group of grenadiers who will destroy everything that you have. Speaking of which, AI and pathfinding are probably the most dated aspects here. As I said, the AI has some general modes that we'll go through, but the big issue is how easy it is for units to be killed. You see, both sides have access to just infantry destruction units in the form of the grenadiers and flamethrowers for GDI and NOD respectively. If they get their attack off, it will just annihilate, no matter how many other infantry you have set up. And if you have them in your squad, when they die they explode, causing more splash damage. But you have to get the units close enough, and there are cases where units that are moving are more likely to miss their shots, and they're also more likely to miss their shots if they're attacking a moving target. You can exploit this by moving a vehicle around once it's kind of considered the main target by the enemy, and it will just keep flailing and trying to hit it while your other units will destroy it. And this does lead to some very weird shenanigans in terms of the balance. The idea is that machine gun fire is supposed to be used against infantry, explosions are supposed to be used against tanks. But you see, because you can crush units with tanks, it gives NOD a huge advantage. 4 or 5 small tanks can just destroy dozens of infantry before they even get a chance to attack it. And it makes things a lot harder for the GEI side when you have a bunch of NOD infantry and they can just dodge your medium and mammoth tanks. Now, the mission structure here does feel a little bit frustrating, and this is compounded by some of the fixes made to the remastered. You see, GEI's airstrikes have been improved, and they can oftentimes track and hit multiple times. While this is a game that features by far the worst anti-air support or anti-air defense out of all the Command & Conquer games. You see, if you have your SAM sights or anti-air stacked in one corner, they will not be able to multi-target individual planes. They'll hit the first plane, but they will not strike the second one, and you only need one for it to destroy your entire infantry and sometimes vehicle line. The idea is that you're supposed to stagger your anti-air. Have them set up far enough away so that one group targets one group targets the other. But that is just not practical on the maps, and again, how limited you are in terms of base building. The best strategy is to kind of set up a priority bombing zone for the AI. This is usually done by setting up an obelisk and a few SAM sites. And once you have that set up, the AI will prioritize that above all else, allowing you to move your other units around and do what you need to get done. So again, this is one that if you have not played any real-time strategy games or any Command & Conquers, it's kind of hard to recommend you go straight back to this one. The lack of rally points, general pathfinding in the AI does leave it the most dated. It still has some fantastic music, and the FMVs have that very kind of like cheesy 90s charm to them. But it still stands as the progenitor of Command & Conquer, and definitely deserves a place in terms of like the Hall of Fame of RTS design. And with that, we jump forward slightly ahead in terms of evolution to Red Alert 1. This was originally conceived as kind of an expansion to the base game, but was then blown up to be its own, where Command & Conquer was originally pitched as kind of slightly future tech and warfare back in the mid-90s. Red Alert is all about kind of 1950s sci-fi, where sci-fi can just do anything we need at any point. To wit, we killed Hitler using a time machine invented by Einstein that completely breaks World War II, and now it's the Allies and the Soviets battling for domination. The Allies are built as the more agile and technologically superior faction with better air, while the Soviets have just raw muscle with better tanks and just throwing everything they have at the player. And you'll have both factions having their own campaign. The cutscenes here aren't as, I think, cheesy, but with some weird exceptions here and there. Oh. Damn. Hmm. Well, this one is kind of played more straight. In terms of the RTS side, or the design side, we do see a step forward. The maps are far larger, they're more complicated. The baseless missions become more puzzly in general, but they also become more frustrating on the higher difficulties. You see, difficulty affects unit damage, and on the highest difficulty, the enemy can just destroy your limited squad before you can even do anything. Especially when you have those dogs and kind of like do like 360 nose scopes in the air to kill your units. This is also the Command & Conquer that introduced us to naval battles and the annoyance of that. And it wouldn't be until I think Red Alert 3 where the Navy side gets kind of like a really big shot in the arm. In terms of design, again, a lot of this game is built on the same AI and behavior of the first game, which is why I'm not going to spend as much time on this one. To me, I think this one is more dated than the base Command & Conquer, simply by the fact that it does feel like the first game, but with a slightly reskin here and there, and again, without having Kane chewing it up in the cutscenes. Still, with the remaster, it can be playable today, and it will be the basis for what's to come when we talk about Red Alert 2 and 3 later on in this video. We now get to Tiberian Sun, and this would be the second of what many people consider just to be the 3 games of the Tiberium side of Command & Conquer. And while for those of you looking at this right now, that this game looks incredibly dated, again, now being about 24 years old, at the time, this was kind of ahead of its time in terms of production values and design. At this point, StarCraft has already come out and kind of dominated the RTS side of things. And this was Westwood's attempt to kind of strike back and make a new Command & Conquer. And we can see this all over, from the improved movies and visual design to a complete rebuild of our factions of GDI and Nod. So, the first thing we have is that we officially move into pure sci-fi. No more slightly maybe kind of future tech here. This is way in the future. It is kind of post-apocalypse or maybe starting apocalyptic, with Tiberium taking over the planet. GDI is trying to stop it. Nod is trying to do something special with it. They will get access to one heck of a MacGuffin that will show up quite heavily in Command & Conquer 3. We once again have Kane back chewing things up, and as a very interesting aside, Tiberian Sun really represents kind of what would be kind of like peak action sci-fi of the 90s. It's kind of very cheesy, very hammy style. I gotta fight the real villain, James Earl Jones.
In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! Cain lives!
Hey, look who it is. The likes of which we saw with shows like Hercules, Xena, even something as far as like Farscape, although I think Farscape came a little bit later. And when we talk about Command & Conquer 3 later in this video, you'll see how much the tone has shifted. But for this one, we have 2 completely different campaigns played with 2 very different factions. GDI, of course, has all the money, power, and hardware they can throw at things, including the Mammoth Mk2, I think it is. That is just, well, a very big tank. They also get flyers in the form of jetpack units, and some of the more annoying enemies to fight against AI, and that is the disc-throwing grenaders. But really, the faction that steals the show here is Nod. They get so many quite frankly like troll abilities that they can use against the player, or you can use against the AI or in multiplayer. We have underground APCs that if you don't have concrete set up, just leaves your base open to an engineer rush. You have flame tanks that can now dig underground and pop up and destroy buildings where you can even say the word rush. Nod also gets artillery cannons, which are perhaps the most busted unit in any RTS ever made. These things are super long range tracking, and 3 of them set up will just quite frankly destroy any ground based army before they can even get within range to attack them. And GI doesn't really get a lot of good counters in that respect. Their flying units are really solid, but Nod again just steals the show. Speaking of, our campaign structure here is quite interesting. This is still a story and FMV driven campaign. Both sides will have their own major stars, and you'll have different objectives to clear. But one thing that this game does I don't think we've seen from any other RTS is that you have story missions kind of set up as a chain or a sequence. Some of these missions are optional and they're designed to make the main mission easier. If you destroy their reinforcements in a bonus map, then they'll have fewer troops to throw at you during the main one, or you'll have more time to complete an objective. And I'm surprised we didn't see more developers try and use this kind of mission structure. You'll still have a mix of base and baseless missions in Tiberian Sun. And while they're a little bit better on the baseless side, it can still come down to a little bit more of trial and error. Again, when you only have 2 or 3 units, and there are a lot of anti-infantry or anti-vehicle things that can just destroy you before you even see them coming. In terms of the actual design, you still don't have attack move or very easy rally points. There's this kind of waypoint system that you can set up different things on the map, and if you set a unit to it, they will patrol or follow it. It is a little bit more confusing than I think it needs to be, but it does kind of set the stage for more advanced unit controls and foundations for the later RTSs. Our combat still relies on the rock, paper, scissors system that has been the foundation or the bedrock of these games. But you can still crush infantry, and air does throw things out of whack. I do like the mission structure, and as somewhat of a side tangent, the expansions for all the Command & Conquer games are really well done with introducing more varieties of missions. They're not always just about escalating the difficulty, although the final missions certainly can be, but they do provide more variety in terms of environments and challenges for the player. And Firestorm here at Tiberian Sun is no exception to that. In terms of the RTS side in of itself, it does still feel a little bit dated. It's not as bad as C&C 1 or Red Alert 1, but you still have to deal with an AI that gets a lot of advantages against you. The different difficulties simply affect what your starting money is. It does not hold back the AI at all. And whether you play this game on easy, medium, or hard, they will still rain artillery destruction down on you, or send lots of grenadiers to blow up everything in your base. But still, the game holds up, I would say, pretty well. It's, even from technical issues with the game being, I think, about 24 years old at this point, it is still very much playable. And if you've played the previous ones, and this one should definitely be on your list, as it still occupies a very interesting point in the RTS side, and in terms of Westwood's history. This would be the last main series Command & Conquer game that Westwood would work on before the studio's sad closure in a few years. And now we get to what would be the official final RTS game to come from Westwood Studios with Red Alert 2. This is considered by many to be the high mark of the franchise, and for me, I think this is going to be my personal favorite of all the C&Cs. We now take us to an even more alternate take on the world, with the Allies and Soviets fighting now in modern, or I should say early 2000s time, instead of World War II. This is a game that we finally get rally points, and we can set them from our structures, still no attack move, although it's not as felt in this one compared to some of the earlier examples. Like Tiberian's son before it, this is when we finally get our factions to be fully different and unique from one another, with the only exception being having engineers. Both sides have completely different units and completely different philosophies for their structures and tactics. Allies get superior kind of technology and more flexible air. Soviets get just raw might and the ever popular Kirov blimps, which for them will just destroy anything if you don't have any anti-air set up. Our story is that the Soviets have the psychic power of Yuri backing them, and they initiate another war. And you must either save communism or capitalism over the course of the campaigns. The mission structure here once again is still a combination of base and baseless, but mission variety is really well done, and that extends into the expansion that I'll come back to in a few minutes. You'll still have to deal with the enemy's base in no matter what kind of environment, but the AI has been more improved. It still kind of can build units endlessly compared to you, but once you take out the command yard and any kind of major structure, the game will just basically tell the AI, sell everything, send to the player's base, and just end this map. This is a far cry from Tiberian's son and previous Command & Conquers, where the mission objective is usually just destroy literally every building, unit, and wall section the enemy has in order to complete your mission. Now, as you play through, you will have a greater extent of naval units, but Navy is better in this one compared to Red Alert 1. The Allies get psychic dolphins, and the Soviets get giant squids, and I'm sure that is perfectly explained. The MFVs have also seen a major step up compared to previous games, and this game definitely has kind of like peak 2000s like B-movie actors and actresses in all the roles, with of course the actor playing Yuri just stealing the show anytime that he's on screen.
What is that? Who is there?
Oh. Hey, it's Jurassic Park. With a kind of unit design and faction design, as I said earlier, both factions are now different from each other, and that extends even further with multiplayer, that introduces more unit diversity with each sub-faction gaining one unique unit added to their group. This can of course change how you play things in multiplayer, and you also get access to a few of them during the Yuri's expansion with those missions there. But all in all, both factions get their own mix of overpowered strategies and design. The Allies get of course the Rocketeers that if you leave them alone, and they can just harass you to no end. And the incredibly overpowered Prism tanks that can just nuke anything before they get in range. Now, to counter that, Soviets get better anti-air with their flak troopers, the kind of flak trucks, and the anti-air guns themselves, and they also get their own overpowered strategies in the form again of the Kirov blimps, and even be able to use terror drones to cause a nightmare to enemy vehicles. And the missions themselves are set up really well to accommodate both sides of this. With our missions and the unit designs again mentioned, the GUI here is far more improved with the rally points and still making use of the vertical command bar. And really again, other than not having attack move feature, it still holds up quite nicely. Speaking of, Yuri's Revenge as an expansion is phenomenal. It introduces Yuri's faction as not exactly playable in single player, but a very major threat, as you must deal with psychic troops, psychic tanks, and psychic structures. And both factions get new units and tactics to deal with that. At this point, when you play the base game of Red Alert 2, the Soviets don't really have good long-range anti-unit units, and this becomes very damning near the penultimate part of their base campaign when you have to deal with Yuri himself slight spoilers for a game that's over 20 years old at this point. But the expansion introduces siege copters, who can set up anywhere there is ground and can rain death from a far distance, and is pretty much designed to be the Soviets' answer to long-range combat, other than of course the V3 rockets, which are more anti-structure than they are anti-unit. You also get demolition trucks, and the game's expansion for both campaigns does a really good job of pushing you out of your comfort zone. The missions themselves are there both to entertain, as well as give you a taste of using some of the new units and some of the sub-factions as well. In one of the earlier Soviet missions, you have to make use of the Iron Current Demolition Truck combo in order to get into Yuri's base and destroy his Psychic Dominators, so they don't mind control your units before they get close. The final Soviet mission I really enjoyed as well, as throwing quite literally everything at you, and you must defend and figure out a way around. Now, as a point about this, and this actually comes as a really good time to mention this kind of aspect of Command & Conquer's design. Many of the missions, as I said earlier, are very script or event trigger focused, and that does mean that the first time through, these maps can be more annoying than you may think they are. Because of this, there is some trial and error to the missions, and Red Alert 2 definitely has this in full display. Some of the final missions can become very annoying to deal with until you learn, okay, there is a free airport over here, a free oil derrick over there. I was supposed to go here, I was supposed to deal with this first. And while this is not, again, meant to damn or condemn Command & Conquer, it is a very important deal to point out about the mission design and structure of it. And one of the big examples I wanted to mention again goes back to the final mission of the Soviet side of Yuri's Revenge. When you have 3 fully stocked bases of units coming at you from all angles, you're supposed to figure out that there is a demo truck in the bottom right hand corner of the map that you can use to deal with one of the bases, making things far easier. And if you didn't happen to snoop around there, you may think that you're supposed to fight 3 fully stocked bases all at once. And this again is kind of like the hallmark of Command & Conquer's gameplay and mission structure, that you can brute force these missions. It will be painful, it will take a long time, but it is possible. But there is oftentimes a smarter and more efficient way to do this, with the final mission on the Allied side making use of both Soviet and Allied super weapons and units. You can just really tear apart Yuri's massive bases, and it becomes a lot more interesting, a lot more fun to do this other than just throwing units into the grinder and hoping that someone gets through. Red Alert 2 also comes with a fan-made mod / expansion, Mental Omega, that is considered one of the hallmarks not only of Red Alert 2, but of mods in general. And at this point, I have not played it yet, but it is on my list to play. As I said at the start of the section, Red Alert 2 is my favorite of the Command & Conquers. It has that right mix of kind of FMV cheese and charm, really great faction and unit design, and mission variety to go with it. And definitely a recommendation for me to play this one and see what is kind of considered the heights of Command & Conquer. We now turn to Command & Conquer Generals, and this is definitely the black sheep of the franchise, at least during the early 2000s. And it's important to remember the atmosphere and the situation that was going on at the time. With Generals, this game was created by EA Los Angeles, which was the remainder of the people who stayed on following Westwood Studios' closure by EA and joining this studio. And EA LA would go on to become kind of EA's premier RTS studio for the remainder of the decade. The mandate for Generals was to create the next big esport for the RTS market. Those of you who don't remember, during the late 90s through to the early to mid 2000s, StarCraft and by extension Blizzard were king. StarCraft was the undisputed most recognized and popular esport in the world, Blizzard riding the successes of StarCraft, Warcraft, and of course, World of Warcraft was one of the highest rated studios on the planet, and definitely a far cry for the audience watching this today. But there was this chase by developers to try and beat StarCraft. And throughout the 90s, StarCraft and Command & Conquer operated as kind of two sides of the same coin for RTS. Kind of like Street Fighter vs. Mortal Kombat, Sonic vs. Mario, etc., etc. So with Generals in particular, a lot of the redesign and decisions were trying to make the next-gen RTS, the one that's going to push the genre forward in new and wondrous new directions. And with it, what we got was a lot of changes to the fundamental design, pacing, and even the tone and aesthetics of the game. We take place quote-unquote in the real world, using United States, China, and the Global Liberation Army, or GLA, which is just basically every Middle Eastern terrorist trope rolled into one. Instead of 3 separate campaigns, you just get kind of like a bunch of missions like strung together as like minor vignettes. There's an attempt to make a greater story in 0 Hour, but definitely a far cry from the likes of seeing Joe Khan, and even going with Michael Brin and other famous actors in previous games. There is no cheese whatsoever in Generals, other than I guess like them trying to be really over the top with some of the unit descriptions and barks. We also no longer have the command bar. And it seems like that is the curse of Command & Conquer. Whenever they have a game that doesn't feature the verbal command bar, it means something bad's about to happen. Instead of you being able to build and prime buildings anywhere you go, you must always be clicking on your unit production buildings. If you need to build something, you have to select your kind of bulldozer / construction unit. And again, this is more reminiscent of that of StarCraft, Age of Empires, and other RTSs, but it is definitely not what we come to know about Command & Conquer. Featuring more upgrades, this is also the first Command & Conquer to introduce the idea of faction powers. That as you kill enemies and make progress, you'll be able to unlock them, and they can be passive or active uses. One thing that makes this game incredibly dated, besides again just like the tone and structure being super serious, trying to be again as realistic or quote-unquote realistic as one can be, is the unit AI. This is my least favorite of all the Command & Conquers in terms of AI behavior and unit pathfinding, and that says something considering we'll get to Command & Conquer 4 later in this video. The issue is that the AI is designed that general movement is almost giving them like no defense or any kind of advanced thinking. The idea again is to try and make this more esport friendly. So esport players want to be constantly interacting, they want to be constantly APMing, always be villagering, a wrong game, and so on. So they don't want the game to kind of give you any concessions. The problem is that it makes things far more unwieldy for casual players because of it. So while we were playing this, I noticed that your units will only defend if they are being attacked and the enemy is within range. If they're being hit and the enemy is just slightly out of their attack range, they'll just stand there and take it. The only way to get your unit to actually defend themselves well is to always be issuing guard move or attack move orders. The standard move just does not work. This also comes into play when you're fighting against the GLA, who have a lot of suicide bomber based attacks. Because the suicide bombers aren't technically attacking the enemy as they're running, your units will just sit idly by while demo trucks and bombers will just run straight into them. The mission structure here is still that mix of base and baseless design. And the game does do a very interesting job of trying to do like a Michael Bayification of the cutscenes with a lot of zoom-ins, pan shots, explosions, more explosions, dams exploding, and you get the picture. Now, in terms of the faction design themselves, this is one area where Generals does still hold up pretty nicely. All three factions are completely different from one another. United States has kind of the best technology and best air support. China has kind of the best tanks and a lot of cheap units and tactics like that. And GLA is kind of, again, like the nod analog and have a lot of troll-based abilities and is more about kind of sneaking around the map, setting up the different bunkers, tunnel networks, and so on. And that part of the game, even with the upgrades themselves, still holds up really nicely as an RTS. It is, again, fundamentally different playing one faction to the other, and that is what you want to see. But the issues with the AI and just general pathfinding just found, at least for me, to be too frustrating to play, and the lack of a really engaging story and actors chewing up the scenery didn't really give me much motivation to keep playing. Now, one thing that I do want to touch on is 0 Hour, because it does represent one of the more substantial changes to Command & Conquer and to RTS design as a whole, and that is by formally introducing the notion of sub-factions. This comes in the form of the different generals. Each general has a specific playstyle that pushes their respective faction in a different way. The Air Force general obviously likes Air Force, so they have fewer vehicles and they have stronger planes, copters, and so on. The Demo general for GLA likes blowing stuff up, of course. And I really like this idea of customizing factions and giving them unique ways of doing something different. And when we come back to Command & Conquer 4 at some point in this video, I want to talk about how they failed in this respect, whereas Generals and 0 Hour did succeed. This one, again, it plays nothing like any of the other Command & Conquers, and in a way, that may make it good for you to check out if you can get it to work. It can be a little finicky with the Steam version on modern computers, but because it plays nothing else like it, I would at least recommend, if you haven't checked out the other Command & Conquers yet, to give this one at least a try first. That way you're not kind of missing all the stuff from the other games when you check out Generals. But it still feels like this very weird period, not just in terms of the early 3D, but with trying to modernize Command & Conquer, despite the fact that, again, Red Alert 2 was considered one of the de facto best games in the franchise and one of the just best RTSs as a whole. And as we move on, you're going to see how EA Los Angeles just did a complete 180 pivot in the right direction. Where Red Alert 2 is considered to be the height of the Red Alert side of things, Tiberium Wars, or Command & Conquer 3, is considered to be the best of the Tiberium saga. And this is where we really saw EA Los Angeles come to their own. EA Los Angeles did go on to work with the Battle for Middle-earth franchise, with both games being really fantastic takes on Lord of the Rings, and both you literally can't play today because EA turned off those servers. But with Command & Conquer 3, we saw this return to form in a lot of ways. First, the FMVs are back. Joe Kukan is once again going to be smiling and chewing things up as Kane, and we kind of get like a litany of who's who actors and actresses during that time. If you remember when I mentioned Tiberian son a few minutes ago, I said how the sci-fi depiction there was like very 90s, very cheesy. Well, Tiberium Wars takes us to kind of what we saw sci-fi and TV evolve to in the 2000s. It's darker, it's gloomier, everyone's a lot more serious. And again, this also stars several actresses from Battlestar Galactica, which is one of the hot shows during that particular time. Our story is that it is once again even more in the future. Kane has returned, GDI is in trouble, the world is on the brink of Tiberium disaster. Oh, and then aliens show up to make a mess out of things. Of the kind of RTSs at this time, this is the one that I think really brought kind of the 3D aesthetics and viewpoint to work. even playing this now, or when I play this in 2024, it still looks really fantastic with laser trails, bullets flinging all over the place, ragdoll physics, explosions, and all that. The world has a very nice and detailed look too, especially the areas that have been overcome by Tiberium. As a very interesting point, I love the campaign structure of this one, probably more of any of the Command & Conquers. The game gives you a full kind of region map of each chapter, and you're free to play or replay maps at your leisure. There are bonus challenges that will come in the form of unlocking new lore and tidbits, and the game will also track whether you beat the game on easy, normal, or hard for that completionist. And this is something that I really wanted to see more RTSs do. Now, as for our gameplay, this one feels more like a mixture of old and new C&C design. The command bar is once again back in glorious form. You still can build and prime buildings on it, and get your units ordered no matter what you're looking at on the map. You can now also do more in terms of having the various sub-tabs based on how many unit production buildings you have, as well as any bonus cranes, and this becomes a very big point for people who play this competitively. As for the unit and faction design itself, this is again where we saw the kind of 3 faction standard template, with each faction being its own unique aspect. GDI once again has a variety of air units and some very powerful tanks and siege. Nod gets all their crafty and even new craftier tricks, including more stealth, and being able to drop Tiberium missiles down to rain havoc on someone's economy. And the Skrin, I think that's how they're pronounced, is kind of the oddball faction. They have a lot of units that are like, this is a vehicle that's anti-infantry, this is a infantry that's anti-vehicle, and their units go all over the place. They have some of the most powerful air units in the game as well, with their kind of carrier ships being just the most annoying siege unit next to Nod's artillery from Tiberian Sun. Although they do get a somewhat version of that in the Spectre with the expansion that I'll come back to in a minute. Now, with the base game itself, they also introduce a little bit more kind of categorizing of units between the various factions. You have an official kind of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 in the form of the buildings that you need to produce. Like with generals, you also have upgrades which can be applied during a match, and they do a good job of making your units more powerful, giving them a little bit more utility, etc. And Veteran C, much like with the older titles, makes a very big deal here. Units will now actually have like different trails and color effects when they're fully promoted, and fully promoted units in all of the Command & Conquers that have Veteran C also get free healing. A fully upgraded squad of max rank units will tear apart the enemy easily. Another interesting change that this one brought is this idea of having elite units. And while a lot of people will define it with the super units I'll come back to in a few minutes, each faction here gets kind of one super unit that is designed to have a high risk, high reward to playing them. They not only cost a lot to use, but when they go down, they leave a husk on the field. Anyone who gets an engineer into that husk will capture that unit. If it's the faction that built it, they'll just get it right back. So you have kind of these juggernauts for the GI, which are kind of super siege. You get the avatars, which are just hilarious giant robots that can make themselves stronger by taking apart the units around them. And the Skrin get these kinds of annihilator tripods, they're just like giant aliens that shoot disintegrating rays. And this adds a very interesting dynamic both to single player and multiplayer design. Because as a single player, you can kind of turtle up and entrench yourself, let the enemy throw all their best units at you, then bring your engineers in, and build a second army of their units and then go topple the enemy. And again, with the competitive side, if you leave your units alone, a high-level player will snatch them right up and use them against you. And there's also far more faction powers in this one. Now, unlike generals, the faction powers are not tied to leveling up, and are instead tied to which buildings and tech buildings you construct during a match. And they can certainly lead to a lot of interesting strategies. In terms of the overall faction design, I do really like things with Tiberian Wars. You have 3 very interesting and very distinctive factions, and they all get their own kind of, again, moment in the sun with their units. Such as the GDI with the Zone Troopers that just drop down and they can shoot these just massive rail guns that can destroy vehicles very easily. And this is definitely one, as a quick aside, where a lot of the infantry base units really get their moment in the sun. While you can still run them down with some of the heavier units, rocket squads or kind of the anti-vehicle infantry for all 3 factions can really do a number on you, even in the late game. And there's definitely a lot more variety and uses of units in this one. While of course you're going to want to use Juggernauts, Avatars, and the Tripods, you can still have suitable armies in all phases of the game using the lighter units to hit and run strategies, bombing runs, etc, etc. And really, in terms of the faction unit design, I really don't have a problem with anything here. The GUI and UI UX have been improved. You, of course, can now set rally groups or rally points as well, control groups, all that good stuff. You can even have vehicles drive in reverse, which I have watched professional players of this do this easily, and it's astounds me to see it, but I have no idea how you can control that in the middle of a match. And all in all, Command & Conquer 3 Tiberian Wars is a fantastic game. The only issue with this game, at least for the modern market, is that the base game featured a multiplayer balancing patch that affected the single player side. Like the previous games before this, the AI is technically not playing the game as the player does. They are built on scripts, and that means that they can pump out infinite units. Now, in previous games, that's not that big of a deal, as you can fund an army to fight them. But you see, one of the points of the multiplayer balancing was to reduce the amount of Tiberium that you can mine from any given patch. But the maps are still built around the assumption that you have access to the full supply. During one such map, I literally ran out of Tiberium, and I could not even build an army to invade the enemy. Now, pro players will of course scoff at this and say, well, you just have to be very tricky, and that is true. You can win any map in Tiberium Wars on the highest difficulty through kind of using subtle tactics, get in, destroy their construction yard, destroy their unit production, and you're done. But it does represent a very unnecessary difficulty spike for the game. If you're a casual or just trying to get in this game normally, at least for the base campaign, I would keep it on normal or maybe even go to easy in some spots. Unlike Tiberium Sun, the difficulty does affect the properties of the missions as well. So you'll get access to better units, or the enemy will have fewer units to attack you if you're playing on easy or normal versus hard. And it is such a shame, it is a good lesson for designers watching this, that you always want to treat your single and your multiplayer design as 2 separate experiences. And that will be coming back up when we get to C&C 4. Now, those issues are not present in Kane's Wrath, the expansion. Once again, I have very little complaints about the expansions to all these games. They all do a great job of fleshing out the base game, adding in new units and features, and just being really a solid extension of the core game. Kane's Wrath kind of fills in the gaps between before C&C 3, during C&C 3, and then after C&C 3. Unfortunately, endings still feel a bit kind of abrupt in how it ends, and sadly there's not much we can do about that at this point. But once again, you have missions of very huge variety in terms of challenge, arena, and what you're going to be using. Like generals and 0 Hour, Kane's Wrath introduces sub-factions for each one of the factions, which once again will push them in interesting ways. The Black Hand really like to use flame tanks, flamethrowers, anything flame related, but they don't get access to air. One of the Skrin factions really likes mind controlling units. And it's a great way, again, of being able to flesh out these factions and provide more variation on how someone can play and the tactics available. Kane's Wrath also introduces, for the first time in a Command & Conquer game, the actual factual super unit. Again, many people who play this will call them elite units. I'm just going to call them super units just to keep with the super unit sooner weapon moniker. But each faction gets one unit they can build that just trumps everything else on that faction. They can also have infantry bunker or attached to them that give them additional properties, such as engineers that give healing, rocket or anti-vehicle units that give them more anti-armor, and so on. So GI gets a super big tank that can also harvest fields. Nod gets, well, basically Big Daddy Avatar, and the Skrin get giant spider disintegrating death guy. On top of course having a mothership that they can call down. And these units again command a lot of respect. You have to be prepared for them. And it also adds the dynamic of making EMPs really powerful. If you've watched any high level play of Kane's Wrath, you will see players make extensive use of EMPs to try and shut down the invading army, and particularly the super unit. You EMP that super unit and it is dead, and the opponent is now out a ton of resources. The expansion, as an interesting aside, also has a kind of grand campaign mode, similar to that of Rise of Nations or Battle for Middle-earth 2, which unfortunately we can't play Battle for Middle-earth 2 anymore, like I said earlier. But all in all, Command & Conquer 3, I never played this one when it first came out, so replaying it or playing for the first time today, I was really impressed with it. And I can see again why a lot of people, one, felt like this was a return to form for Command & Conquer, and two, felt like this is one of the best games in the main branch of the Tiberium franchise. And other than, again, the challenge of single player in the base campaign, easy recommendation, and still holds up very nicely in terms of aesthetic, design, and charm. With Command & Conquer 3 being the return to form for the main Tiberium side, fans were eagerly looking forward to Red Alert 3, and what we got was a game that, while it did play differently compared to Red Alerts 2 and 1, it still stood out as being very unique among RTS design, and still delivering a lot of the charm and aesthetics that the overall franchise is known for. So we have all the extreme cheese in this one. I think the FMVs never got more bombastic after this, such as featuring Tim Curry playing a Russian dictator.
Commander, you've rained on my glorious parade. For this, I'm sending everything I've got at you. But I won't let you have the satisfaction of catching me.
Oh, here you go.
One place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
There we go. It was all worth it for that, right? As well as just every female character in this being played by, I believe, a supermodel at some point. Our story is that on the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union, following the events of Red Alert 2, the Soviets invent time travel just because. And they go back and murder Albert Einstein, who, again, previously went back to kill Hitler, causing the whole events of Red Alert 2. But now, in this new timeline, Japan has turned to the Empire of the Rising Sun and will use the powers of anime and more anime to try and take over the world. And you will once again play as commander of one of these three armies to try and see it through to the end. Now, this one features, from an aesthetic standpoint, perhaps some of the most visually distinctive and just bright colors I think I've seen out of any RTS to date. Each faction has very specific elements in terms of its art aesthetics and tone. that allows you to see immediately what is an ally building versus what is a Soviet and Empire one. All the units of course have their own custom barks to it, and this is the one that again really hams it up with all 3 factions and all the cutscenes as well. You can tell that all the actors and actresses were just enjoying chewing on the scenery during these cutscenes. Now, the gameplay here is quite interesting. Just like with Generals before, EA was definitely again trying to push more multiplayer, more competitive sides with their RTSs. And what we got as a unique selling point is that the entire campaign, and actually like the entire game in general, is structured around 2v2 or multiplayer battles. Every map in single player will have you teamed up with either another player or an AI partner who will help you on the mission. As a great point about this, I have to say that the AI behavior for your partners, for like 9 out of 10 times, was phenomenal. They would complete objectives, they would keep the enemy busy, they would harass, and it really did help out a lot on these maps, especially when the AI could focus on Navy while I focused on Air. The other aspect of this is that you now have every unit, whether it's a lonely soldier, massive tank, and everything in between, having some kind of alternate or special ability. Your dogs can now stun enemies with their bark. The Empire's units will typically have a transformation that can take them from air to ground, anti-vehicle to anti-infantry, etc., etc. And this does add a bit more micro to it compared to previous games. Now, the general AI behavior in this one is better than it was in general, so it's not as felt as badly compared to that one, but still, the difference between someone who gets the micro and someone who doesn't is night and day, especially in competitive matches, where using a unit's power at the right time can completely shudder and shut down the enemy's army. There is definitely this notion to make this game a little bit speedier to play compared to previous ones, and part of that is changing the economy system. In all Command & Conquers to this point, you're able to build multiple refineries, multiple harvesters to try and capitalize on fast consumption of ore or Tiberium. In this one, every ore field is now kind of like this ore factory, and they can only have one harvester per field. So this makes harvesters and stuff like that a far juicier target, and it also means that you have a far faster setup compared to previous Command & Conquers. I'm kind of iffy on this as a change. I'm curious what you think down below, if you prefer this system versus the kind of more free range. Now, in terms of mission design, part of this kind of process of making every map 2v1 or sometimes 2v versus many on some of the later missions is that the mission structure, I would say, is not as varied in the first one in the grand scheme of things. One thing that I do appreciate is that many maps, instead of just being either all baseless or all base, is that they will often be built around various sections. You'll start a map baseless, you'll then go into a base, and then the map may even expand or change more. And that, I think, is a really interesting aspect that we didn't really see a lot of RTS designers do. Typically, the map you start on a match is the map that you end on. But here, you can have that map grow and expand in different ways, throwing more buildings at you, more objectives, and kind of throwing you for a loop, especially for some of the later missions for each one of the factions. But if you're hoping for kind of like the diversity of being able to have certain maps like throw different tactics or allow you to really engage with the enemy, it doesn't really work that well here. Once again, the AI not playing the same game is on full display, and there are many cases where the AI would not rebuild even if I only destroyed their unit production buildings and not their construction yard. But the AI did get improved for the Commander's Challenge in Uprising that I'll come back to in a few minutes. In that one, it will build and will also adapt to what you're throwing at it to either counter your air with anti-air, your ground with anti-ground, etc, etc. And if you can destroy their unit-producing structures, you can just basically cut them off at the kneecaps and they won't be able to do anything more about it. And as another point, because this is played co-op, your AI partner will be sharing the resources. This can come back to bite you on some of the final maps where just straight up throwing the army or your army at the enemy is not going to work. And the one limitation the AI has is that it's not good at doing anything tactical, like sneaking a few blimps around the map, using the chronosphere correctly, and stuff like that. They leave it to you to do those plays. But again, if you're going into this expecting the same exact experience as the previous Command & Conquers, you may be disappointed, but I did end up enjoying this kind of mission structure because you really don't see anything else like that. And again, this also goes with the faction designs. As I said a few minutes ago, with each faction and each unit having different abilities, it gives everyone a greater chance to stand out. You once again have the allies featuring really solid air units and crazy technology. Soviets get some raw muscle, and the Kirov blimps are once again back, and they also have a NAS feature. And the Empire is just, let's just throw all anime at you and see what you can make of it. Now, as I said earlier, a major point of Red Alert 3 was also really pushing naval. I'm not sure what was the decision to make things more naval focused, but this is a game that has by far the most naval units and naval combat out of almost any RTS out there. Each faction's units, many of them can be amphibious and cross the water, but you have many units from the water that can mess with the land, such as siege units, aircraft carriers, and again, units that can go from land to sea, such as these massive battleships the Allies get that just basically they crawl off the water and turn into super tanks that can crush anything underneath them. Super weapons are once again back, and so are the faction powers and the faction system from generals. You have 3 tabs or 3 trees of powers, and you can go down them as you see fit, either making your units better, unlocking new things you can use to mess with your opponent, and so on. So we went through the entirety of Red Alert 3, did all the campaigns, all the expansion stuff. I even went through and did the Commander's Challenge. And this is a good way to segue into talking about the expansion. This will be our final expansion talk for this video. Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 Uprising adds in 4 mini-campaigns, consisting of between 3 and 4 missions apiece for the various factions, and Yuriko's challenge. Now, the expansion story missions don't really add as much to the story to it compared to, say, Yuri's Revenge and some of the other stuff we talked about earlier, but they do present a very well done change of pace in terms of difficulty and design. Each mission is noticeably harder and more complicated than the missions in the main game. This is also helped by the fact that you are playing it entirely solo. While you may get help from the AI once or twice, these are going to be focusing on you against the AI, which means that it will play a lot nastier against you since you don't have an AI to back up. And I enjoy this from a mission structure. They're a lot more varied, and you are going to be tested. The expansion adds in new units for each one of the factions, and the faction, or the new units for it, they feel like they're designed to deal with or compensate for an issue that they had in the base game. The Soviets get a brand new kind of walker/turn, which is now super anti-air, as well as the mortar bikes, which is perhaps one of the best tier 2 kind of siege units in the game. Allies get the gunship, which is just basically the allied version of the Kirov, but much faster. And the Empire gets a new super weapon or super unit in the form of, well, just giant killer robot, along with really powerful infantry anti-air. And they all do a great job of adding more to each faction, and of course for use in multiplayer. Yuriko's kind of mini campaign is a little bit weird. It kind of plays like essentially a commando unit or commando campaign, and it works, but it does feel a little bit limited in that respect. But the real meat of the expansion comes with the Commander's Challenge. This is, I believe, 50 maps involving you beating up the various factions on maps and kind of difficulty modifiers set to them in order to capture their tech, which you can then use on later maps. I really love the concept of this, and there's some really engaging challenges, such as one where you must use the entirety of everyone being shrunk, so everything moves super fast and has a squeaky voice, but it also means that all units are weaker. And the AI is tweaked for the maps to focus on specific strategies or specific units, and you are free to use whatever faction you want to take them on. Now, the thing that does kind of hurt this is the par times. The par times are very inconsistent in terms of how much or how little they give you. On some maps, it feels like they could have given you just like 10 hours and you won't feel it. Other maps expect you to build, rush, and deal with the enemy within maybe 4 minutes or less. And this game forced me to do something completely horrible and tragic, and that is do a dojo rush and MCV rush. And I don't even know how I can stand to look at myself anymore after all that. I do like the structure of this, with being able to unlock the new units or new tech, which you can then take back into previous maps. And like I said, the variety here is strong enough that you're not really going to be given the same challenge twice. Although, because if you're going for par times, it does mean you're going to have to focus on specific strategies. You're the Empire, dojo rushing. Russia, of course, gets twin blades for some very mid-game aggression, and so on. But I do love this mode, and I do wish that we saw more RTSs make use of it. Someone told me that StarCraft 2 has a mode similar to it, which I have not had a chance to play yet as of this time. But the expansion, like all the others, and like Red Alert 3 to the base games that we've covered, is a very solid one. And as I played through more of this and did all the expansion stuff, I did come around to appreciating this game more, and I can see again why these kinds of late games from EA LA did stand out and kind of carve out a respectable fan base and success on their own, with people of course still enjoying the original Westwood entries. So Red Alert 3 and Uprising, again, easy recommendations from me, and definitely still hold up quite nicely if you want to play it in today's market. And now we get to the downer of this video to talk about Tiberium Twilight, the final and really final Command & Conquer game released. So this one has been almost universally panned. It is considered to be the death nail in the franchise, the nail in the coffin for EA Los Angeles, and just kind of the sign that the RTS market truly did kind of collapse during the 2010s. The story goes is that EA Los Angeles was tasked to create the next kind of hyper-competitive RTS for the market. And at this point, it was still focused on the South Korean pro-StarCraft 2 scene, as mobile games and competitive mobile games really didn't become a focus by developers until like the early 2010s, maybe mid 2010s, which is also where we saw several Command & Conquer games that I'll mention briefly after we're done here. But during development, they ran into issues and it was getting kind of out of scope, and the decision came down in order to try and earn more money off of this game to transform it into what would be considered the final game in the Tiberium saga of Command & Conquer. And what we ended up getting is a game that feels like it's pulled in 17 different directions at once, or should I actually say 3 directions at once, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The first elephant in the room we have to talk about is the DRM. At this point, I've already said that EA is horrible when it comes to kind of preserving their games and their online servers. And with Tiberium Twilight, it required an always online connection whether you play it online or not. Trying to get this to work today was some kind of mixture of luck and black magic, as it worked, then it stopped, then it worked again, Then I had to create another account, and then somehow, some way, it started working again. I was able to stream and show it off. But this was already bad enough back then, let alone doing it today. As for our story, it is even more in the future, and the world is even more on the brink of collapse. Instead of you playing as a nameless commander, you get a commander whose name I've already completely forgotten, except you don't talk at all in this game, but everyone really cares about your opinion and your emotions, including your wife, who has about 3 minutes of dialogue before she's either killed or kidnapped, depending upon which faction you play. You do not control the screen during the campaign. Instead, you only have GDI and nod. The cutscenes are perhaps the weakest to date. Some of them are maybe 20 to 30 seconds long, and they just don't really do anything. The scene chewing has been removed. So has also a lot of unit design and structures. And this takes us to the most controversial decision. Part of the redesign for Command & Conquer 4 and try to make it more esports caliber was to make it faster pace. And to do that, you now have this focus on a mobile base. Your MCV is now your entire base wrapped up into one, almost as kind of like a champion in a MOBA. That it is going to be the thing you're going to push forward with to attack or hang back and defend. The units that you build that come from the MCV are 100% disposable. As long as it survives, or the MCV survives, you are still in the fight. There is no more resource collection, no more features along those lines. And this, again, for a Command & Conquer game, was terrible. The idea of having like a mobile, like eternal base, however, that is something that I wish we saw more developers explore, because there's definitely potential there. But what we got here is just fundamentally broken. And this is one part because of the unit designs, and one part because of the progression. So, the big thing about Command & Conquer 4 is that you do not have a one complete faction. You have 3 sub-factions split into offense, defense, and support. Each one of these versions of your MCV has its own unique units and kind of things it can do. Offense gets the best units and can be the most aggressive on the field. Defense is the only MCV that can build defensive structures. Yes, you heard that right. This is an RTS that involved base building, where base building has now been almost removed. And support is the only one of the 3 that can actually use kind of like the faction powers or any special abilities. And again, I think this is keeping with this idea of trying to make a MOBA oriented RTS. So someone would play as the offense MCV, and they could be paired with the defense, who would provide defense for them while the offense would go out and push. The unit designs here just feel very weird. The rock, paper, scissors balance has been further delineated down. It's no longer infantry or anti-air, anti-infantry or anti-vehicle. Now it is anti-light armor, anti-medium armor, anti-heavy, and anti-structure. And this means that the idea is that you're supposed to be fielding a mixed army. However, this is the only Command & Conquer where you now have a unit cap or command points. You start with 50, and as the campaign goes on, it may go up here and there. But it severely limits what you can put out, and it fundamentally breaks these maps. Because every single player map is clearly designed around multiplayer, that if you are fighting against more than one MCV, you will always lose the numbers game. But there's no AI here. Gone is that very fantastic AI partner from Red Alert 3. So when I'm trying to kill an MCV, and they have 2 MCVs on the field, I can't do anything because I'm outnumbered quite literally 2 to 1. The game, once again, it features this idea of the unit counter. So anti-medium would go up against medium units, anti-light to light, and so on, so on. But because you're always being outnumbered, you can't really make use of the rock, paper, scissors counter. Yes, you may counter that tank with your tank, but if he has like 10 other units fighting you, well, it really isn't going to help you. Elite and Veteran C has been made more awkward, and instead of units gaining experience, you have to collect Tiberium crystals that your enemy drops to rank up just one unit. But again, given how flimsy your units are, you're not really going to be able to see like the full use of this compared to previous games. No more being able to entrench units inside the various structures, no more being able to construct, again, really solid defenses unless you are the defensive MCV. During the single player, the game wants you to be able to swap between the 3 different MCVs, but that still just feels very weird for a game like this. What they should have done, I think, is just simply let you have double the command points when you're playing on single player, just so that you can keep up with the enemies. And speaking of keeping up, this takes us to the other controversial point. There's many of them during this section. You have an account level that dictates which units, techs, and upgrades you're allowed to use. As a very big point, all accounts at level 0 do not get anti-building units. That means if you're going up against a high-level defense player, or just another player in general, it will take you ages to knock down any structures they have. And they can just marshal over with their kind of siege units and destroy your MCV. Just a very big, I think, misstep by developers there. As you go up in the tiers, they introduce more powerful units, they'll start getting unique powers, and the techs do matter, but you are not able to just level up through play. In order to get to level 10, you either need to play a lot of multiplayer, or get through the entire single player campaign for each faction, which again is not helped by the very boring and kind of lifeless story here. If you try to play against another player who is higher level than you, more than likely you are going to lose, because A, they'll be able to field better units than you, B, they'll have more upgrades than you, and they can just destroy you so much more than you can destroy them. Something like this could have worked if they really lean into this idea of like a deck builder, or being able to like turn yourself into your own sub-faction. Maybe I just want to build a faction out of fire units. Maybe I really like lasers or infantry. Let me build myself around that, instead of just locking it to this very annoying progression. And it's why it's such a shame that this game did not work, because they were really trying to chase the competitive side, but the lesson that is always learned is when you chase the esports market like hardcore, your game will more than likely fail, because you're going to create something that people aren't going to want to jump into, and there's no interest in it, then there won't be interest in playing it competitively. And you kind of, burn the candle at both ends. And with C&C 4, again, you can make this kind of faction and unit diversity work, but you have to come at it with already having a solid base. The problems with C&C 4 remind me a lot of the issues I had with Gotham Knights, and kind of what I saw with Kill the Justice League. Instead of a very unique and all-around character, they tend to take a really solid concept and break into 3 or 4 different characters that just feel like less than the sum of their parts. This is the thing that kind of befell Redfall with the vampire game that I think everyone has forgotten about by now. And with Command & Conquer 4, this kind of design, it just is conflicting with itself every which way. You want me to send my MCV into combat and do stuff, except it has no attack at the start. You want me to have a low unit total, but my units are very generic and don't do much on their own. And the maps, again, have very little personality to them, very little in terms of structure. Again, not having any kind of economy also hurts the variety of the maps. There are things you can capture on the map, but again, because you're supposed to be constantly moving around and not staying in one spot, it kind of doesn't really matter all that much. And despite being able to finally play this in 2024, it was definitely like a whimper to end this entire look at Command & Conquer on. And if you can get it to work, you can certainly give it a try and let me know if you can find any hidden gems in it. Before we go to the final section, just as a kind of quick point, after the collapse of EA Los Angeles and Command & Conquer disappearing, EA tried several times over the 2010s to create mobile and live service versions of the game. There is the kind of MMO RTS one that we play a little bit of. There was Command & Conquer Rivals. I believe there's Command & Conquer Legion now. Rivals was okay. You're not going to be seeing a footage of that here because I never captured it on my phone. But it was kind of like, again, like a mobile pseudo, like a Clash of Clans or Clash Royale style. And it wasn't too bad, but it still had elements of pay to win. And Legions is out, but not out in the United States. It may never come to the US, and the people who play it are not enjoying it. And once again, whenever EA decided to try and make a heavily monetized or esport version of Command & Conquer, it just ended up failing. And that's really all I have to say on this point. Well, this video certainly got a bit long, didn't it? But we finally come to the end. It has been a very fun trip for me to revisit and in some cases play for the first time the entirety of the Command & Conquer franchise. And it still feels very bittersweet how things ended up. I would say if you are interested in RTS design, especially the more traditional style, everything from Tiberian Sun and on, outside of course of Tiberium Twilight, still holds up well in its own unique and strange way. With Command & Conquer as a whole, it is very interesting to look at this compared to how StarCraft and the other RTSs came about during the 2000s into the early 2010s. Where those games, I would say, in terms of a technical or balance standpoint, are more precise, Command & Conquer, out of all the ones that I've played, just has style to it. And again, that is helped a lot by the FMVs, the various storylines, and of course, designing factions and units that really feel unique or to their place. You're not going to find a similar unit of the Avatar compared to the Assault Carrier of Red Alert 3, or of course, the We Got the Rockets from Command & Conquer 3 to Kirov's. And it's a great example of how much having a unique aesthetic and tone can really elevate and keep a game feeling timeless. And I would also say that starting from Command & Conquer 3 to Red Alert 3, that it really does show just how beautiful these games can look when you turn on all the bells and whistles and effects and explosions and all that. And it is still, again, such a misstep by EA to just pull the plug on the series and try to chase after the mobile live service goldmine. And I do think there is the possibilities of making a live service RTS work, but this is already getting way too long as a video as is. You can buy all the copies of my RTS book when they're released. That will answer that question for you. With Command & Conquer, as I said, this still holds up very well. And you can see again, with the likes of Command & Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3, these attempts at pushing the franchise forward. And they both succeeded in their own ways. And there are still lessons here that you can learn as an RTS designer, especially in terms of designing original and unique single-player maps, and focusing on unique unit designs that fit within specific roles. This is a great game to study, or the series as a whole is a great one to study if you're looking to examine different unit functionalities across factions. What is the Siege version of the Allies versus the Empire? How does the hero unit of Nod work versus the hero unit of GDI? And you can see how the different faction philosophies can bend and alter these unit roles, and then designing unique abilities to further kind of encapsulate those unique aspects of it. And for those of you watching, I'm curious what are your favorites of the Command & Conquers. After everything is all said and done, I would say my top 3 would be Red Alert 2, Red Alert 3, and then Command & Conquer 3. The reason why is that Red Alert 2 still holds up brilliantly, despite being the oldest of the top 3 that I mentioned. I really love the mission design varieties, and it really gets even better when you get to Yuri's Revenge. Just fantastic design all around, and still heavily supported with a variety of mods that are available. Red Alert 3 takes it over Command & Conquer 3 for me just in terms of sheer variety and value. Love the Commander's Challenge in it, and I really came around to just how unique and varied the 3 factions are, and how you really do have to adjust your mindset and playstyle between them. And Command & Conquer 3 just makes it a 3rd place simply by the fact that I enjoyed the previous 2 games more, but still a phenomenal game. The only knocks against it are the balancing issues in the first one, but still really great mission design. I love the structure of it, and it just really has like the best ending to the Tiberium saga compared to Twilight. And all 3 of these games still hold up brilliantly in my opinion. I think all 3 do a very fantastic job of showing off the unique aspects that Westwood and then of course EA/LA brought to the franchise. Maybe we'll get a new RTS at some point, but it's kind of hard to see if anyone will ever get close to the same style and flair that Command & Conquer is known for. There are a few new RTSs coming in 2024, but I don't see them, having a character who's going to cheese it up or just throw lots and lots of Kirovs at everything. But that's going to do it for this incredibly long video. Thank you for surviving with me to the very end. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and look forward to more videos and long form content coming real soon. But I need to rest my voice and my micro play fingers a little bit after everything that we've done. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff, be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.